In the land once known as Mesopotamia, literally the land between rivers, human civilization first found its enduring form. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, two great waterways that rise in the mountains of Anatolia and flow toward the Persian Gulf, early humanity discovered both hardship and possibility. The unpredictable floods, scorching summers, and arid plains of this region forced innovation. From the struggle to control water emerged the first systems of agriculture, governance, and written communication. What began as scattered farming communities would, over thousands of years, evolve into the world's first cities. Around 10,000 BCE, in the wake of the last ice age, the people of the Fertile Crescent began a slow transition from nomadic life to settled farming. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Jarmo, Muribit, and Tel Hassuna reveals small groups cultivating barley and wheat, domesticating goats and sheep, and building simple mud brick dwellings. These were modest beginnings, yet they marked the decisive shift from survival to management of the environment. For the first time, humans began shaping the land to their will rather than merely adapting to it. Over centuries, these small settlements grew more complex. The early farmers learned to store grain and redistribute it within their communities, giving rise to the idea of surplus. Surplus meant stability. Stability enabled population growth, trade, and specialization of labor. As the population expanded, so did the need for cooperation. The coordination of harvests, water use, and distribution led naturally to leadership roles, elders, priests, and organizers who managed the rhythm of communal life. These early leaders did not yet command armies or levy taxes, but they established something more fundamental, the principle that order and cooperation could be maintained through shared rules and collective effort. The environmental challenges of southern Mesopotamia required both ingenuity and organization. The rivers that nourished the land were also its greatest threat. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, bringing both fertility and destruction. The early inhabitants learned to tame these waters through irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs. Archaeologists at Chogamami and Tel Essoan have uncovered some of the earliest known irrigation systems, dating to the 6th millennium BCE. These works demanded planning, labor, and maintenance, evidence that organized governance was taking root even before the emergence of cities. With irrigation came agricultural abundance, and with abundance came opportunity for trade. The river networks became arteries of exchange, linking distant regions. Early Mesopotamians traded grain, textiles, and pottery for timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, and precious stones from distant lands. This web of commerce began to bind the settlements together culturally, as well as economically. Clay tokens and counting stones found at sites like Uruk and Susa reveal the origins of record-keeping, an essential step toward writing. By 5000 BCE, the plains of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia began to fill with permanent towns. Among the earliest were Eridu, Uruk, and Uar, names that would later dominate the annals of history. Eridu, considered by later Mesopotamians to be the first city, held particular significance. Its temple, dedicated to the god Enki, represents one of the earliest examples of monumental religious architecture. Layer upon layer of rebuilding at the site suggests centuries of continuous worship, symbolizing a stable and enduring community bound by spiritual tradition. As settlements grew, their organization reflected both practical and religious concerns. The temple, or ziggurat, became the focal point of social life, a raised platform that served as both a sanctuary and an administrative center. The surrounding dwellings, workshops, and storehouses formed a pattern that would define Mesopotamian urban planning for millennia. Archaeological strata show evidence of specialized artisans, potters, metalworkers, and weavers, whose products supported trade and ritual life alike. The interplay between environment, belief, and economy shaped every aspect of early Mesopotamian culture. Religion served not only as a system of faith, but as the language of order. The people viewed the natural world as governed by divine will, and their survival depended on maintaining harmony with these unseen forces. Priests became the interpreters of divine balance, managing offerings, rituals, and community affairs. In this sense, spiritual authority and administrative organization emerged together, inseparable from one another. The technological and social transformations of this era also gave rise to the earliest expressions of law and measurement. Clay tablets from the late Akkad period show evidence of standardized weights and measures used to regulate trade and taxation in kind. The concept of fairness, of maintaining cosmic balance through human order, became embedded in their worldview. This was the seed of what later civilizations would call justice. By 400 BCE, the cultural landscape of Mesopotamia had become distinct from its neighbors. The Akkad and Uruk periods saw a remarkable acceleration of innovation. Pottery wheels, copper tools, and organized workshops indicate a society now capable of mass production. At Uruk, monumental temples such as the Eanna precinct reflect both the scale of devotion and the administrative complexity required to sustain such projects. The city, sprawling across more than 200 hectares at its height, may have housed tens of thousands of people, an unprecedented concentration of human life. It was within this environment that one of humanity's most transformative inventions emerged: writing. Around 3200 BCE, the need to record transactions, inventories, and temple offerings led to the creation of pictographic symbols impressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. These early marks evolved into cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped impressions that could represent words, sounds, and ideas. What began as accounting became communication. Writing allowed knowledge to transcend generations, preserving not only economic records but hymns, laws, and myths. The rise of writing also deepened social stratification. Those who mastered it, the scribes, became an educated elite, central to the functioning of the temple and state. Schools, known as adubas, trained young men in mathematics, language, and administration. Through their tablets, we glimpsed the birth of bureaucracy and scholarship, the earliest evidence of systematic education. Meanwhile, the expansion of urban centers demanded more formal systems of governance. Leaders who once ruled by spiritual prestige began to consolidate military and political power. The Nsi, or city governor, emerged as both religious figurehead and civic administrator, while the Lugal, or great man, commanded armies and directed major construction projects. The tension between collective administration and personal rule would define Mesopotamian politics for centuries to come. Archaeological findings also reveal the beginnings of intercity diplomacy and conflict. Clay tablets record trade agreements and boundary disputes, while weapons and fortifications attest to competition over water and land. The world's first wars were fought not for conquest, but for irrigation rights, an early sign of how the control of resources could shape human destiny. The cumulative achievements of this era transformed human existence. In less than 2 millennia, the people of the two rivers had advanced from scattered agricultural villages to complex urban societies governed by written law, organized religion, and economic interdependence. They laid the groundwork for nearly every aspect of civilization: cities, administration, trade, architecture, art, and intellectual inquiry. Yet even as they thrived, the seeds of their challenges were already sown. Dependence on irrigation required constant maintenance and cooperation. Competition among cities threatened stability, and the growing hierarchy of temple and palace introduced inequalities that would later spark reform and rebellion. Civilization had been born, but it was not yet secure. The Mesopotamian experiment, this fragile balance between nature and control, divine will and human reason, would now enter its next stage. From the growing wealth and rivalry of the Sumerian cities, a new political and cultural order would rise, one that sought not merely to survive, but to organize the world according to human design. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the scattered towns of southern Mesopotamia had matured into thriving city-states. Together, they formed what history now calls Sumer, the world's first urban civilization. The Sumerians, a people of uncertain origin but distinct language and culture, transformed the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates into a network of independent yet interrelated centers of power. Cities such as Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, and Kish stood as monumental expressions of human ambition, each governed by its own ruler, devoted to its own gods, and sustained by the agricultural wealth of the surrounding countryside. The Sumerian landscape was one of contrasts, harsh in climate, yet fertile through ingenuity. Every city was surrounded by canals and levees that channeled river water into cultivated fields. Agriculture was the foundation of life, supported by a complex system of irrigation that required constant coordination. Fields of barley and wheat fed the growing population, while date palms and herds of sheep provided secondary resources. These achievements, however, were communal. They demanded oversight, labor organization, and long-term planning. From this necessity emerged one of humanity's earliest forms of structured government. At the heart of Sumerian governance stood the temple, known as the ziggurat. These immense structures, rising in stepped terraces above the city, symbolized the axis between heaven and earth. Each was dedicated to a particular deity who was regarded as the true owner of the city. The temple's priests were not only spiritual leaders, but administrators, economists, and record keepers. They managed vast estates of farmland, stored surplus grain, and directed labor for construction and irrigation. The temple thus functioned as both church and state, a fusion of the sacred and the practical that defined the Sumerian worldview. Archaeological excavations in cities like Uruk and Eridu reveal temple complexes that served as the administrative nucleus of urban life. Storerooms contained clay tablets detailing agricultural yields, rations for workers, and temple expenses. These tablets represent some of the earliest examples of organized record-keeping in human history. The emergence of writing in the late 4th millennium BCE had revolutionized society, transforming oral memory into permanent documentation. The cuneiform script, impressed into clay with a reed stylus, evolved from pictographic signs into a full linguistic system capable of expressing abstract ideas, laws, and literature. Through writing, the Sumerians developed the tools of civilization, law, administration, and education. Schools known as adubas trained scribes in reading, mathematics, and accounting. The ability to read and write became a mark of authority and expertise. The scribal profession, often hereditary, gave rise to a literate bureaucracy that maintained the records of temple and palace alike. These written archives reveal the sophistication of Sumerian society. Lists of workers, contracts, hymnals, and even mathematical problems that show an advanced understanding of geometry and arithmetic. Sumerian science extended beyond mathematics. Their astronomers observed the movements of the stars and planets, correlating them with the agricultural calendar and religious festivals. The Sumerians divided the year into 12 lunar months, creating one of the earliest organized calendars. They also developed the sexagesimal, or base, 60 system of counting, an innovation that still shapes the way modern societies measure time and angles. This intellectual curiosity reflected a broader desire to impose order upon the cosmos, to understand and harmonize the rhythms of the heavens with the patterns of human life. Daily life in Sumer revolved around production and trade. The craftsman's workshop was as vital to the economy as the farmer's field. Pottery, metalwork, and weaving became refined arts. Sumerian artisans produced decorated ceramics, bronze tools, and intricate jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli. The cylinder seal, a small carved stone used to authenticate documents and property, became both a practical tool and a medium of artistic expression. Each seal bore detailed imagery, processions of worshippers, divine emblems, scenes of harvest, capturing the values of a society deeply attuned to both labor and spirituality. Trade connected Sumer to distant lands. Without natural resources such as timber or metals, the Sumerians relied on exchange networks that stretched across the ancient Near East. Boats plied the rivers and the Persian Gulf, linking Sumer to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, Magan, Oman, and Malua, the Indus Valley. From the north came wood and stone, from the east, copper and tin. In return, the Sumerians exported textiles, grain, and crafted goods. These commercial ties not only brought material wealth, but also facilitated cultural exchange, spreading Mesopotamian influence across vast distances. Despite their shared culture, the Sumerian city-states remained fiercely independent. Each city viewed its patron deity as supreme and guarded its autonomy with pride. Political power rested with the Ensi, a governor-priest who managed the affairs of the city in the name of its god. Over time, as populations expanded and military conflicts intensified, some Ensi claimed the title of Lugal, meaning great man or king. This marked a critical shift in political structure, from collective priestly administration to hereditary monarchy. The earliest recorded wars in human history took place among these rival city-states. Boundary disputes over water rights and agricultural land often erupted into conflict. The Stele of the Vultures, a limestone monument from Lagash dating to around 2450 BCE, commemorates the victory of Eannatum of Lagash over neighboring Umma. It depicts rows of disciplined soldiers and the king himself leading them in battle, symbolizing the emergence of organized armies and the concept of state warfare. These conflicts, while destructive, also stimulated innovation in fortification, weaponry, and governance. Religion permeated every aspect of Sumerian life, binding together the temporal and the divine. The pantheon reflected both the forces of nature and the structure of society. Anu, the god of the sky, embodied supreme authority. Enlil, lord of the winds, represented order and kingship. Enki, god of water and wisdom, presided over creation and invention. Inanna, goddess of love and war, symbolized fertility and power in equal measure. Each city's temple served as the earthly dwelling of its patron god, and rituals of offering, sacrifice, and celebration maintained the cosmic balance. Sumerian mythology, recorded on clay tablets, reveals a civilization deeply reflective about its origins and destiny. Tales such as the Epic of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta and the Instructions of Shuruppak show early literary and moral traditions. These stories emphasize themes of wisdom, obedience to the gods, and the tension between human ambition and divine law. In these narratives lie the seeds of later epics and scriptures, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to biblical parallels like the Flood story, which scholars trace to the Sumerian Atrahasis epic. Social structure in Sumer was hierarchical but functional. At the top stood the ruling elite, the king, priests, and wealthy merchants. Beneath them were craftsmen, farmers, and laborers, followed by slaves, many of whom were war captives or debtors. Despite these divisions, Sumerian society was not static. Workers could achieve prosperity through trade or craftsmanship, and religious institutions provided support for widows and orphans. The Sumerians conceived of justice as balance, a reflection of the natural and divine order. The earliest known legal reforms, instituted by Urukagina of Lagash around 2350 BCE, sought to protect the poor from exploitation and limit the power of the priesthood. Sumerian architecture reflected their desire for permanence and order. Cities were laid out along a central axis leading to the main temple complex, surrounded by residential districts, markets, and defensive walls. Houses, built from sun-dried brick, clustered along narrow streets that reflected centuries of gradual expansion. Palaces emerged alongside temples, signifying the growing distinction between religious and royal authority. Archaeological remains from Uar and Eridu show evidence of advanced drainage systems and standardized construction, testimony to organized urban planning. Cultural life flourished in the shadow of the temples. Music, poetry, and ritual performance formed part of daily worship. Harps, drums, and lyres accompanied hymns written in cuneiform on clay tablets, the earliest musical notation in human history. The Sumerians celebrated festivals tied to agricultural cycles, reinforcing their connection to the land and the heavens. Their art emphasized symmetry, reverence, and motion, portraying both divine grandeur and human devotion. As Sumer reached its zenith, its influence extended far beyond its borders. Northern and Western neighbors adopted Sumerian technology, writing, and administrative practices. The Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people living in central Mesopotamia, learned from Sumerian scribes and priests, gradually integrating into the cultural fabric of the region. The Sumerian language became a vehicle of intellectual prestige, used in religious and legal contexts even after it ceased to be spoken in daily life. Yet the very qualities that made Sumer great, its independence, wealth, and complexity, also made it vulnerable. Rivalries among cities weakened collective strength. Irrigation, though essential, caused long-term soil salinization, reducing agricultural yields. Environmental stress, compounded by political fragmentation, undermined the stability of the region. As trade routes shifted and pressures from neighboring peoples increased, Sumer's unity faltered. By the mid-24th century BCE, the balance of power in Mesopotamia was poised to change. From the north, the city of Akkad rose under the leadership of a determined and ambitious man named Sargon. Drawing upon Sumerian institutions, but driven by a new vision of centralized rule, he would forge the first empire in human history. The age of the city-state was giving way to the age of empire, a transformation that would reshape Mesopotamia and define the next stage of civilization. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia had matured into a landscape of prosperous, yet competing city-states. Each had its patron deity, its own temple bureaucracy, and its distinct traditions of kingship. But their rivalries, fueled by disputes over irrigation channels and trade routes, gradually eroded the delicate balance that had sustained Sumerian civilization. Into this fractured world emerged a transformative force, the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadians were a Semitic-speaking people who had long lived in central Mesopotamia, north of Sumer. Their language was related to Hebrew and Arabic, distinct from the isolate Sumerian tongue. For generations, they had absorbed Sumerian culture, its religion, script, and administrative systems, while maintaining their own linguistic and tribal identity. This cultural symbiosis created fertile ground for political unification. The Akkadians were familiar with Sumer's systems of governance, yet they viewed the city-state's fragmentation as an opportunity to establish a broader, more centralized authority. At the heart of this transformation stood Sargon of Akkad, one of the most remarkable figures of ancient history. Known in later legend as a man of humble origins who rose to kingship through merit and ambition, Sargon began his career as a cupbearer in the royal court of Kish. Around 2334 BCE, he seized power, overthrew the Sumerian king Lugalzagezi of Umma, and began a campaign of conquest that unified all of southern Mesopotamia under his rule. In doing so, he founded what is widely regarded as the first empire in recorded history. Sargon's capital, Akkad, also called Agade, became the administrative and symbolic heart of this new order. Though its precise location remains uncertain, it was likely situated near modern-day Baghdad, strategically positioned between north and south. From here, Sargon extended his authority over an area stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Contemporary inscriptions boast that he ruled all the lands from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea, suggesting a scope of control unprecedented in the ancient world. The establishment of the Akkadian Empire marked a fundamental shift in political organization. Whereas earlier Sumerian rulers governed city-states through divine stewardship, Sargon centralized power in the person of the king himself. The monarch became not merely the servant of the gods, but their earthly representative, a divine agent entrusted with maintaining cosmic order through military strength and administrative justice. This innovation laid the foundation for imperial governance in the ancient Near East. Administration under Sargon and his successors was systematic and far-reaching. Provincial governors, often drawn from the royal family or trusted officials, were installed to oversee conquered territories. These governors collected tribute, maintained local order, and enforced royal decrees. The empire's scribes recorded transactions, tax receipts, and decrees on clay tablets written in cuneiform, now adapted for the Akkadian language. This linguistic transition marked an enduring legacy. Over the following centuries, Akkadian would replace Sumerian as the dominant language of diplomacy and administration across Mesopotamia. Sargon's conquests also fostered an economic transformation. The unification of Mesopotamia brought trade routes under a single authority, enabling safer and more efficient exchange of goods. Merchants traveled freely from the Gulf to the Levant, carrying textiles, grain, and metalwork, and returning with timber, copper, and precious stones. The empire's capital, Akkad, became a nexus of commerce and craftsmanship. Its artisans produced finely carved statues, intricate cylinder seals, and standardized weights and measures, a testament to the growing complexity of economic life. Religion, too, evolved under imperial rule. Sargon and his successors promoted the Akkadian goddess Ishtar, equated with the Sumerian Inanna, as the empire's divine protector. Temples dedicated to her were built throughout the realm, reinforcing spiritual unity and royal legitimacy. The gods of conquered cities were not abolished, but incorporated into a broader pantheon, symbolizing the empire's inclusiveness under a single divine hierarchy. This strategy strengthened loyalty and minimized resistance, aligning religious devotion with political allegiance. Sargon's reign endured for more than 5 decades, a remarkable span in a volatile age. Yet his success was not without challenge. Rebellions flared in distant provinces, and the logistics of controlling a vast territory strained the empire's resources. Sargon reportedly campaigned repeatedly to suppress revolts, ensuring the continued flow of tribute and labor. The very concept of empire, while revolutionary, demanded constant vigilance. Nevertheless, Sargon's administrative and military achievements provided a model that later empires, from Babylon to Assyria and Persia, would emulate. Upon Sargon's death, power passed to his sons Rimish and Manishtushu, who faced the inevitable turbulence of succession. Both rulers fought to maintain imperial unity, subduing revolts in Sumer and Elam. Their inscriptions reveal a world in which rebellion was a persistent threat and where the assertion of royal authority required both force and diplomacy. Despite their efforts, the empire's stability would ultimately depend on Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, one of the most celebrated and controversial kings in ancient Mesopotamian history. Naram-Sin's reign, around 2254 to 2218 BCE, represented the pinnacle of Akkadian power. A skilled general and visionary ruler, he expanded the empire to its greatest extent, campaigning into the Zagros Mountains, Anatolia, and even the fringes of the Levant. His military victories brought immense wealth and prestige, which he used to glorify the monarchy. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa, depicts the king wearing a horned helmet, a symbol traditionally reserved for gods, as he ascends a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath his feet. This bold iconography declared Naram-Sin's semi-divine status and the absolute nature of his kingship. Such imagery marked a turning point in the conception of authority. The divine kingship that Naram-Sin claimed was both a reflection of political reality and a statement of ideology. By identifying himself with the gods, he reinforced his position as the unifying force of the empire, transcending the older, city-based loyalties of Sumerian culture. However, this assertion also drew criticism from traditionalists who viewed it as impious hubris, a dangerous blurring of the boundary between human and divine. Under Naram-Sin, the empire reached new levels of organization. He commissioned large-scale construction projects, including new temples, roads, and fortifications. Administrative reforms standardized taxation and labor obligations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Brak and Nugur shows Akkadian-style architecture and artifacts, indicating direct imperial presence. Trade continued to flourish under royal oversight, connecting Mesopotamia with distant lands and enriching both the capital and provincial centers. Yet the grandeur of the Akkadian Empire contained the seeds of its decline. The burdens of maintaining such an expansive state, combined with environmental pressures, gradually weakened its foundations. Evidence from sediment cores and abandoned settlements suggests that around 2200 BCE, a severe climatic event struck the Near East. Reduced rainfall and increased salinity devastated agriculture, leading to famine and depopulation. This 4.2-kilo-year event, as modern climatologists term it, coincided with widespread social unrest across the region. Inscriptions from Naram-Sin's later reign mention rebellions and invasions by mountain tribes known as the Gutians. These groups, originating from the Zagros highlands, exploited the empire's weakened state to raid and eventually overrun much of Mesopotamia. The imperial bureaucracy collapsed, trade networks disintegrated, and urban populations dwindled. Akkad itself vanished from history, leaving only scattered references in later texts to its splendor and fall. Later Mesopotamian traditions remembered Naram-Sin's reign as a cautionary tale. The Curse of Akkad, a poetic text written centuries later, portrayed the empire's downfall as divine punishment for the king's arrogance. In the story, Naram-Sin offends the gods by attacking their temple at Nippur, leading them to unleash famine and invasion upon his realm. Though mythologized, the tale reflects a deep cultural memory of collapse, an awareness that human ambition, no matter how grand, remains subject to natural and divine limits. The fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE ushered in a period of fragmentation and recovery. The Gutian incursions disrupted central authority, and for nearly a century, Mesopotamia reverted to local rule. Yet the legacy of Akkad endured. The idea of a unified empire, governed by a centralized administration and bound by a common language, would inspire future generations. Akkadian remained the lingua franca of diplomacy for over 1,000 years, and its script continued to be used across the Near East. In the south, amid the ruins of former greatness, the Sumerian cities slowly began to reassert themselves. Through careful reconstruction and renewed religious devotion, they sought to restore the order that had once defined their civilization. This revival, known to historians as the Sumerian Renaissance, would bring about a flowering of culture, learning, and statecraft that rivaled even the glory of Akkad. From the ashes of empire, Sumer would rise again, not as a collection of rival city-states, but as a unified cultural force under the third dynasty of Ur. And so, the story of Mesopotamia continued, an unbroken thread of human resilience woven through conquest, collapse, and renewal. The Akkadian ascendancy had demonstrated both the potential and the peril of centralized power. It left behind not only ruins and legends, but also the enduring structures of empire, bureaucracy, ideology, and the written word. These would shape the destiny of the two rivers for millennia to come. The fall of the Akkadian Empire left Mesopotamia fragmented and vulnerable. The once proud cities of Sumer lay in partial ruin, their canals neglected, their temples looted, and their fields choked by salinity and drought. The Gutian tribes, who had swept down from the Zagros Mountains, ruled the region with loose authority, offering little stability or centralized administration. For nearly a century, disorder reigned in the land that had once been the heart of civilization. Yet, as in so many cycles of Mesopotamian history, decline was followed by renewal. Out of this chaos emerged a powerful resurgence of Sumerian culture, known as the Sumerian Renaissance, a period of revival centered on the city of Ur. This renaissance began in the late 22nd century BCE with the efforts of local rulers determined to reclaim their heritage. In Lagash, rulers such as Gudea restored temples, revived irrigation systems, and sponsored vast construction projects. Gudea's reign, around 2144 to 2124 BCE, symbolized the transition from disorder to reconstruction. His inscriptions, carved in elegant cuneiform on diorite statues, describe a ruler devoted to piety, justice, and civic duty. The famous statues of Gudea depict him seated in serene contemplation, hands clasped in prayer, a visual representation of divine stewardship. Under his leadership, Lagash flourished once again as a cultural and economic center, setting the stage for broader regional revival. It was, however, in the city of Ur that the full restoration of Sumerian civilization took shape. Around 2112 BCE, a man named Ur-Nammu rose to power, overthrowing the last remnants of Gutian control and uniting southern Mesopotamia under his rule. He established what historians call the third dynasty of Ur, Ur-3, marking the beginning of a new golden age. Ur-Nammu's state was not merely a return to past forms, but a synthesis of Sumerian tradition and Akkadian administration, an organized, centrally governed kingdom that combined piety with bureaucratic precision. Ur-Nammu's reign represents one of the earliest examples of systematic statecraft. His government standardized weights, measures, and taxation, ensuring fairness and efficiency in economic life. The king's administration employed hundreds of scribes to record agricultural production, labor assignments, and trade transactions. The sheer volume of administrative tablets discovered at Ur, Umma, and Drahem demonstrates the scale of this bureaucratic achievement. This network of officials, working under royal oversight, sustained a centralized economy that redistributed goods and resources across the land. One of Ur-Nammu's most enduring achievements was the codification of law. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BCE, predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. Composed in the Sumerian language, it established fixed penalties for various offenses and sought to protect the weak from exploitation. The prologue declares the king's divine mandate to establish equity in the land and banish wickedness and violence. These early legal formulations show a sophisticated understanding of justice rooted in moral responsibility rather than divine whim. The laws regulated commerce, family relations, and property rights, reflecting the complexities of an advanced urban society. Architecture flourished under Ur-Nammu's vision. The most iconic monument of the Ur-3 period is the ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped temple dedicated to the moon god Nana, the city's patron deity. Rising over 20 meters above the plain, this structure embodied the unity of religion, politics, and architecture. Built from mud brick and faced with baked brick set in bitumen, it symbolized both technological mastery and spiritual devotion. The ziggurat's design influenced temple construction throughout Mesopotamia for centuries. Archaeological excavations led by Sir Leonard Woolley in the early 20th century revealed not only the ziggurat itself, but also royal tombs filled with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, evidence of Ur's wealth and global trade connections. The Ur-3 dynasty also restored Mesopotamia's irrigation network, repairing the canals that had fallen into disuse during the Gutian period. Agricultural productivity surged, supporting a population boom and renewed urban growth. Cities such as Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk regained their prominence as centers of administration and learning. Trade routes reopened across the Persian Gulf and the western deserts, bringing timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and luxury goods from as far as the Indus Valley. The economy of Ur was one of remarkable complexity, a state-controlled system that integrated temple estates, royal workshops, and private enterprise. Culturally, the Sumerian Renaissance marked a deliberate effort to preserve and celebrate the past. Scribes compiled, copied, and expanded upon earlier Sumerian texts, ensuring that their language and myths would not be forgotten. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though rooted in older oral traditions, achieved its literary form during this era. Myths such as Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, the Descent of Inanna, and the Instructions of Shuruppak were recorded with precision, reflecting both the spiritual and intellectual revival of the time. These texts reveal a society deeply aware of its own history and determined to define its identity through literature and learning. Education became institutionalized. The Adaba, or scribal school, trained students in cuneiform writing, mathematics, and the recitation of classical texts. Thousands of tablets found in the ruins of Nippur show exercises and lexical lists used in instruction. This emphasis on formal education created a professional class of scribes who served as the empire's administrators, historians, and intellectual elite. For the first time in history, education itself became a cornerstone of governance. Religious life, too, experienced renewal. The Sumerians reaffirmed their devotion to a pantheon that reflected both the forces of nature and the order of the cosmos. Temples were restored, rituals revived, and festivals reinstated. The moon god Nana, the sun god Utu, the sky god En, and the mother goddess Ninhursag occupied central places in the religious calendar. The relationship between humanity and the divine was once again framed in terms of stewardship and duty. The king, as high priest of the gods, was responsible not only for political order but for maintaining cosmic harmony. Under Ur-Nammu's successors, particularly his son Shulgi, the Sumerian Renaissance reached its height. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, from about 2094 to 2047 BCE, and his reign stands as one of the most accomplished in ancient history. A skilled administrator, patron of the arts, and prolific builder, Shulgi expanded the empire's territory and reformed its institutions. He strengthened the central bureaucracy, standardized taxes and labor obligations, and instituted a royal postal system that allowed messages to travel swiftly across the realm. His inscriptions boast of his literacy and learning, describing how he knows the tablets of words and composes hymns in the temple. Under Shulgi's rule, art and music flourished. Temples were adorned with elaborate reliefs, and hymns praising the king's wisdom and piety were performed during festivals. The royal court of Ur became a hub of cultural production, drawing poets, musicians, and scholars from across Mesopotamia. Shulgi also reinforced the state religion by declaring himself the divine son of Nana, thereby merging the authority of king and god in a model reminiscent of the earlier Akkadian monarchs. Despite its achievements, the Ur3 state was not immune to the challenges that had undone its predecessors. The demands of centralized control strained resources and provoked resistance from local governors. The empire's reliance on forced labor for construction and irrigation bred social tension. Moreover, the very environment that had nurtured civilization began to turn against it once more. Over-irrigation and soil salinization reduced crop yields, while shifting trade routes undermined the economic dominance of the southern cities. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur, around 2028 to 2004 BCE, the empire was beset by crises. Nomadic groups such as the Amorites infiltrated the western frontiers, while the Elamites from the east invaded the heartland. Records from the period describe desperate efforts to fortify cities and maintain food supplies. The fall of Ur came suddenly when Elamite forces captured the city, looted its temples, and carried off its treasures and deities. The collapse of the Ur3 dynasty marked the end of Sumer as a political entity. Yet the legacy of the Sumerian Renaissance endured. Its administrative systems, legal codes, and literary works became the foundation upon which later Mesopotamian states were built. The Akkadian language, enriched by Sumerian vocabulary and thought, became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for the next millennium. Sumerian itself ceased to be a spoken language but survived as a language of scholarship, religion, and law. For centuries after its political disappearance, priests and scribes continued to study Sumerian texts as the sacred heritage of civilization's first cities. In the aftermath of Ur's fall, new powers emerged to claim the mantle of Mesopotamian leadership. Among them, one city would rise above all others, Babylon. Situated near the heart of the two rivers, Babylon would inherit the intellectual and administrative legacy of Sumer and Akkad, transforming it into something grander still. Under the leadership of ambitious kings, it would become not just a city, but a symbol of order, law, and human ingenuity. The next chapter in the story of the two rivers would thus belong to Babylon, whose ascent would mark a new era in the history of civilization. In the centuries following the fall of Ur, Mesopotamia entered a turbulent, yet transformative period. The political unity achieved under the third dynasty of Ur disintegrated into a patchwork of small, competing city-states. Amorite chieftains from the western deserts established new settlements along the Euphrates and Tigris, blending with the older Sumerian and Akkadian populations. Elamite incursions from the east and tribal migrations from the north added to the instability. Yet from this mosaic of shifting powers emerged one city that would redefine the ancient Near East, Babylon, a modest settlement that rose to become the cultural and political center of the Mesopotamian world. Babylon's ascent began around the early 19th century BCE, during what historians call the Old Babylonian period. Initially, it was a provincial town under Amorite leadership, ruled by a line of kings who gradually expanded their influence. Its strategic position along major trade routes between Sumer, Akkad, and the western lands made it a natural hub for commerce. Over time, the Amorite rulers of Babylon consolidated power through alliances, diplomacy, and warfare, uniting surrounding territories under their control. The most famous of these kings, and the architect of Babylon's greatness, was Hammurabi. Hammurabi ascended the throne around 1792 BCE, inheriting a modest realm surrounded by powerful rivals. Larsa in the south, Eshnunna in the east, and Mari along the Euphrates to the northwest. Through calculated strategy and patient statecraft, Hammurabi transformed Babylon into an empire. His reign of over 4 decades saw both relentless military expansion and profound administrative reform. By the end of his rule, nearly all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates, was united under Babylonian authority. Hammurabi's success lay not only in conquest, but in consolidation. He understood that true power required order, justice, and shared identity. To govern a diverse population of Sumerians, Akkadians, and Amorites, he standardized administration and codified laws that would apply across his territories. The result was one of the most influential legal texts in human history, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved on a tall diorite stele and displayed publicly in Babylon, the code consisted of 282 laws covering trade, family life, labor, property, and criminal justice. Its prologue declared Hammurabi to be the shepherd chosen by the gods to bring righteousness to the land. The laws themselves were practical and detailed, prescribing fixed penalties for specific offenses. They established the principle that justice should be predictable and universal, not arbitrary. While punishments often reflected the harsh realities of the time, based on social rank and the principle of retribution, the very existence of a written code represented a remarkable advance in governance. The Code of Hammurabi also reflected deep concern for fairness and social stability. It sought to protect the weak from the powerful, regulate commercial transactions, and ensure the honesty of officials. Merchants, builders, and farmers all had their rights and responsibilities defined. For the first time, written law became a visible instrument of state authority, a symbol of the king's role as guarantor of cosmic and civic order. This concept of law as an extension of divine will would resonate far beyond Babylon, influencing later legal traditions in the Near East and beyond. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became not only a center of administration but also of culture and religion. The city's heart was the great temple complex dedicated to Marduk, its patron god. Over time, Marduk rose to prominence within the Mesopotamian pantheon, eventually supplanting older deities such as Enlil in importance. This elevation reflected the political ascendancy of Babylon itself. Marduk's temple, the Sagila, and its towering ziggurat, the Anunnaki, symbolized the city's divine mandate, a bridge between heaven and earth. Rituals performed here reinforced the belief that the king ruled with divine sanction, ensuring order through piety and justice. Economically, Hammurabi's Babylon was vibrant and interconnected. The unification of Mesopotamia under a single administration revived long-distance trade. Caravans moved through the deserts to Syria and Anatolia, while boats carried goods along the Euphrates to the Gulf. Babylon's markets thrived with merchants dealing in grain, wool, metals, and luxury goods. The state imposed regulated prices and standardized weights and measures to maintain economic balance. Records from this period reveal contracts, loans, and receipts, evidence of an advanced commercial society operating under legal and bureaucratic supervision. Education and literature also flourished during the Old Babylonian period. Scribes trained in temples and schools copied and preserved the vast corpus of Sumerian and Akkadian texts. They standardized cuneiform writing, ensuring its continued use across generations. The great epics of earlier eras, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, were translated and refined, shaping the literary canon of Mesopotamia. Wisdom texts, hymns, and proverbs were compiled for use in schools, emphasizing moral instruction and civic duty. Babylon thus became both the political and intellectual successor to Sumer and Akkad, a bridge between the earliest civilizations and the classical empires that would follow. In administration, Hammurabi's reforms mirrored the efficiency of his predecessors while adapting to new realities. He organized his empire into provinces governed by appointed officials responsible for tax collection, justice, and defense. Communication between the capital and the provinces was maintained through an organized courier system, and royal inspectors ensured compliance with central policies. These mechanisms of control allowed Babylon to manage an empire of remarkable diversity, linguistic, cultural, and geographic, under a single framework of law and loyalty. Religious festivals reinforced unity and identity. The Akkad festival, celebrating the new year, became a cornerstone of Babylonian religious life. During this event, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession through the city, symbolizing the renewal of cosmic order and the king's reaffirmation of divine authority. These ceremonies blended theology with politics, making worship a means of governance. Through ritual, art, and law, Hammurabi's Babylon articulated a vision of civilization rooted in harmony between the divine and the human, the ruler and the ruled. Yet, as with all empires, the height of Babylon's power carried within it the seeds of decline. Hammurabi's successors lacked his combination of wisdom and strength. Internal revolts, administrative overextension, and shifting alliances began to erode central authority. External pressures also mounted. To the north, the Hittites expanded across Anatolia, while to the east, new Elamite and Kassite forces threatened Mesopotamia's borders. By the middle of the 16th century BCE, the Old Babylonian Empire had weakened to the point of collapse. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittite king Mursilai I launched a daring raid deep into Mesopotamia, sacking Babylon itself and carrying off its treasures. Though the Hittites soon withdrew, their incursion shattered Babylon's supremacy. In the aftermath, the Kassites, an Indo-European-speaking people from the Zagros Highlands, took control of the city. They would rule Babylon for nearly 4 centuries, ushering in a new era of relative stability. Despite the political changes, the cultural influence of Hammurabi's Babylon never vanished. The city's language, Akkadian, became the lingua franca of diplomacy across the Near East, used in correspondence between Egypt, Anatolia, and Canaan. The Code of Hammurabi continued to be studied and copied long after the empire's fall, shaping legal and moral thought for generations. Babylon itself remained a sacred center, its ziggurat and temple serving as enduring symbols of divine kingship and human achievement. The legacy of Hammurabi's reign extended far beyond his lifetime. His synthesis of law, religion, and governance provided a model for later Mesopotamian states, including Assyria and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His vision of justice as a divine and moral order influenced the philosophies of the ancient world, echoing in later codes and scriptures. Under Hammurabi, Babylon had become not just a city but an idea, of civilization as law, of power as responsibility, and of humanity as capable of shaping its destiny through reason and structure. As the Old Babylonian period gave way to new dynasties and foreign rulers, the spirit of Hammurabi's Babylon endured in memory and record. The idea of a world ordered by law, administered by wisdom, and sanctified by the gods remained a cornerstone of Mesopotamian thought. In the centuries to come, the balance of power would shift northward to a new force that would define the next epoch of Mesopotamian history. From the city of Ashur on the Tigris would arise the Assyrian Empire, a state forged in war, discipline, and ambition, inheriting the legacy of Babylon, yet transforming it into something far more formidable. As Babylon's influence waned under Kassite rule, a new power began to ascend in northern Mesopotamia. Centered on the city of Ashur, this emerging kingdom would reshape the political and military landscape of the ancient Near East. Known to history as Assyria, it was both an heir to Mesopotamian tradition and a harbinger of a new age, an empire defined by organization, discipline, and conquest. What had once been a modest trading city on the Tigris River evolved into one of the most formidable military powers of the ancient world. The origins of Assyria trace back to the 3rd millennium BCE, when the city of Ashur functioned as a vassal under the Akkadians and later the Ur-3 dynasty. Its strategic location on trade routes connecting Anatolia, the Levant, and Babylonia allowed it to grow into a thriving commercial hub. Early Assyrian merchants established colonies in Anatolia, such as Kanesh, where thousands of clay tablets reveal an intricate network of trade dealing in textiles, tin, and silver. These documents, among the oldest known commercial records, display the pragmatic and disciplined character that would later define Assyrian civilization. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Assyria had become a small, but independent kingdom ruled by local dynasts who claimed divine sanction from the god Ashur. For centuries, Assyria remained overshadowed by the greater powers of Babylon, Mitanni, and Elam. Yet its people, resilient, organized, and ambitious, patiently developed the administrative and military tools that would one day propel them to dominance. The turning point came in the 14th century BCE, under Ashur-bal I, who freed Assyria from Mitannian control and declared its independence. This marked the beginning of the Middle Assyrian period, during which Assyria transitioned from a regional state to an imperial power. Ashur-bal and his successors extended their borders through both diplomacy and warfare, establishing Assyria as an equal among the great kingdoms of the Near East. The Middle Assyrian kings built a government grounded in strict central authority. Land was reorganized under royal control, and a professional army was maintained year-round. Laws were codified in a series of decrees that reflected Assyrian priorities: loyalty, discipline, and order. Compared to the humanitarian ideals of Hammurabi's code, the Middle Assyrian laws were severe, emphasizing obedience and punishment. They reveal a society that valued hierarchy and control, a necessity for managing a growing empire in a turbulent region. By the 13th century BCE, kings such as Tiglath-Pileser I expanded Assyria's influence across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and into Anatolia. His inscriptions describe campaigns reaching the Mediterranean, marking the first time an Assyrian ruler proclaimed dominion over all lands from the upper to the lower sea. Though these claims were as much ideological as factual, they reflect an early vision of universal empire. The foundations of later Assyrian greatness, military innovation, administrative efficiency, and ideological ambition were firmly established. After Tiglath-Pileser's death, Assyria entered a period of decline during the 11th and 10th centuries BCE. Nomadic incursions, economic disruption, and internal strife weakened the state. Yet unlike many contemporaries, Assyria did not disappear. Its institutional structure, bureaucracy, army, and religion remained intact, ready to revive when circumstances allowed. That revival began in the 9th century BCE, inaugurating the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the most powerful and organized state the ancient Near East had yet seen. The Assyrians of this era were unmatched in military discipline and engineering. They developed advanced siege warfare techniques, battering rams, siege towers, and movable bridges, allowing them to conquer heavily fortified cities that had once been considered impregnable. The Assyrian army was the first true standing army in history, composed of specialized units including infantry, cavalry, archers, and charioteers. It was supported by a sophisticated logistics network, enabling long-distance campaigns sustained by supply depots and communication lines. At the head of this formidable force stood kings who styled themselves not merely as rulers, but as divinely appointed conquerors. Ashur-bal II reigned 883 to 859 BCE, reasserted Assyrian power through a series of brutal but effective campaigns. His military exploits expanded the empire deep into Syria and secured control over lucrative trade routes. He relocated the capital to Kalhu, Nimrud, where he constructed grand palaces decorated with reliefs celebrating Assyrian victories. These carvings, discovered by modern archaeologists, depict vivid scenes of conquest, tribute, and ceremony, visual expressions of absolute authority. Under Ashur-bal-I's successors, particularly Shalmaneser III, Assyria's reach extended to the Mediterranean coast. The empire's administrative system matured into a model of efficiency. Conquered territories were reorganized as provinces governed by Assyrian officials who reported directly to the king. Tribute and taxes were standardized, ensuring a steady flow of resources to the capital. Roads and relay stations facilitated communication across vast distances. Through this combination of force and order, Assyria transformed from a regional power into a transcontinental empire. In the 8th century BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III reformed the state to meet the demands of empire. He reorganized provinces, integrated conquered peoples into the military, and introduced policies of mass deportation. Though harsh by modern standards, these deportations served both economic and political purposes, Resettling skilled labor where needed while reducing the risk of rebellion. This system helped sustain Assyria's dominance for over a century. Tiglath-Pileser's successors continued to expand the empire's frontiers. Sargon II captured the wealthy city of Samaria, ending the northern kingdom of Israel. His son, Sennacherib, campaigned against Judah and famously besieged Jerusalem in 701 BCE, an event recorded both in Assyrian inscriptions and the Hebrew Bible. Sennacherib also transformed the capital city of Nineveh into a marvel of engineering, constructing aqueducts, gardens, and vast palace complexes adorned with intricate reliefs. The apex of Assyrian civilization came under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon, previously destroyed by his father Sennacherib, demonstrating the dual nature of Assyrian rule, ruthless in war, yet capable of reconciliation. His campaigns extended Assyrian influence into Egypt, briefly uniting the Nile and the Tigris under a single imperial system. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian monarch, presided over the empire's cultural zenith. His palace library at Nineveh contained over 30,000 clay tablets, texts on science, literature, medicine, and religion. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved for posterity thanks to Assyrian scribes. This library represents one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient scholarship, embodying the Assyrian belief that knowledge was both a tool of governance and a reflection of divine order. However, the empire's scale and ambition sowed the seeds of its downfall. The Assyrian system depended on constant military expansion and the extraction of tribute from conquered lands. As the empire grew overstretched, rebellions multiplied. Babylon, always proud and resistant, revolted repeatedly. External enemies, Medes from the east and Chaldeans from the south, joined forces against Assyria. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes captured and destroyed Nineveh, ending the Assyrian Empire after more than 1,000 years of existence. Its fall was catastrophic, but not without legacy. The administrative and military innovations pioneered by Assyria, provincial governance, standing armies, and communication networks, would influence every subsequent empire from Persia to Rome. The image of Assyria that survived in later memory was one of might and terror, shaped largely by the accounts of its enemies. Yet beneath the conquests and cruelty lay an enduring legacy of organization, learning, and statecraft. The Assyrians saw themselves as instruments of divine will, maintaining order in a world of chaos. Their empire, though built on conquest, preserved and transmitted the intellectual traditions of Mesopotamia to later ages. As the dust settled on the ruins of Nineveh, the torch of Mesopotamian civilization passed once more to Babylon. Under new leadership, the city of Marduk would rise again, restored to glory and destined to leave its own indelible mark on history. In the aftermath of Assyria's fall, the political landscape of Mesopotamia once again transformed. The mighty empire that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries lay in ruins, its capitals sacked, and its provinces in open revolt. From this collapse emerged a coalition of powers that filled the vacuum left behind. Chief among them were the Medes, who controlled much of the Iranian plateau, and the Babylonians, who reclaimed the heartland of southern Mesopotamia. Under their leadership, Babylon experienced a renaissance, a final flowering of Mesopotamian civilization known to history as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The revival began under Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader who rose to prominence in Babylon around 626 BCE. The Chaldeans were a tribal people who had long inhabited the marshlands near the Persian Gulf, occasionally clashing with Assyrian governors. Nabopolassar united these southern tribes and declared independence from the waning Assyrian rule. Over the next decade, he forged alliances with the Medes, orchestrating a series of campaigns that culminated in the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE. By 609 BCE, the last remnants of Assyrian resistance were extinguished, and Nabopolassar stood as ruler over a reborn Babylonian empire. This new empire inherited both the administrative sophistication of Assyria and the deep cultural heritage of Sumer and Akkad. Babylon once again became the nucleus of a powerful state, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Its rulers sought not merely to conquer, but to restore, to re-establish the city's ancient prestige as the spiritual and intellectual heart of Mesopotamia. Under Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, this vision would reach its full expression. Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, was one of the most capable and ambitious monarchs of the ancient world. A military strategist and master builder, he combined expansionist policy with grand urban renewal. His early campaigns consolidated Babylonian control over the Levant, defeating the Egyptians at Carchemish in 605 BCE and securing trade routes through Syria and Palestine. He later subdued the Kingdom of Judah, capturing Jerusalem in 597 BCE and again in 586 BCE after a rebellion. The destruction of Solomon's temple and the deportation of the Jewish elite to Babylon became one of the defining events of Near Eastern history. The Babylonian exile, which profoundly shaped the later religious and cultural identity of Judaism. Within Babylon itself, Nebuchadnezzar embarked on an unprecedented program of construction. He restored and expanded the city's walls, temples, and palaces, transforming Babylon into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. At its peak, the city covered nearly 850 hectares, enclosed by massive double walls and guarded by monumental gates. The most famous of these, the Ishtar Gate, stood adorned with blue-glazed bricks and reliefs of bulls and dragons, symbols of the gods Akkad and Marduk. This gate formed the ceremonial entrance to the processional way, a wide avenue leading to the great temple complex of Asagila and the towering ziggurat at Anunnaki, often identified as the inspiration for the later biblical Tower of Babel. These projects were more than architectural achievements. They were political and spiritual statements. Through them, Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed Babylon as the divinely chosen center of the world, the place where the gods communicated with humankind. The restoration of Marduk's temple re-established the religious hierarchy that had been disrupted by centuries of Assyrian domination. During the annual Akkad festival, the statue of Marduk was carried through the processional way, symbolizing cosmic renewal and the reaffirmation of the king's divine mandate. For Nebuchadnezzar, architecture was theology cast in brick. Every monument was an act of devotion and a declaration of power. The city's economic life flourished alongside its monumental splendor. Situated between the Tigris and Euphrates, Babylon commanded the trade routes linking the Gulf, Iran, and the Mediterranean. Agricultural estates along the riverbanks produced grain, dates, and wool, while merchants traded copper, timber, and luxury goods. The state maintained meticulous administrative records, tablets documenting land sales, loans, taxes, and temple inventories. The efficiency of Babylon's bureaucracy reflected centuries of accumulated Mesopotamian expertise in governance and record-keeping. Culturally, the Neo-Babylonian period witnessed a deliberate revival of ancient traditions. Scribes copied and preserved Sumerian and Akkadian texts, ensuring the continuity of Mesopotamia's intellectual legacy. Astronomers at the Babylonian temples developed sophisticated methods for observing the heavens, recording planetary movements with remarkable precision. These observations laid the groundwork for later advances in Hellenistic astronomy. Mathematics and medicine also thrived, building on principles first established in earlier Sumerian and Assyrian schools. Nebuchadnezzar's reign also inspired later legends, including the famous story of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. While their exact existence remains debated, ancient accounts describe terrace gardens filled with exotic plants, irrigated by ingenious water-lifting devices. Whether real or symbolic, the story captures the essence of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the mastery of engineering to create order and beauty from the harsh Mesopotamian environment. Following Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire entered a period of instability. His successors, Amel-Marduk, Neriglissar, and Labashar-Marduk, ruled briefly, unable to maintain the same level of control or vision. Power eventually passed to Nabonidus, a ruler of unusual character and religious outlook. Nabonidus elevated the moon god Sin above Marduk, disturbing the traditional priesthood and alienating the city's elite. He spent much of his reign in the oasis of Tama in Arabia, delegating rule to his son Belshazzar, a figure remembered in later traditions for the writing on the wall. Nabonidus's religious reforms, while intellectually intriguing, weakened the empire politically. His neglect of Babylon's temples and absence from the capital created resentment among priests and administrators. Meanwhile, a new power was emerging on the eastern frontier, the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, Cyrus advanced into Mesopotamia and captured Babylon without a major battle. Contemporary accounts, including the famous Cyrus Cylinder, describe the conquest as peaceful and divinely sanctioned. Cyrus portrayed himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator who restored order and respected local traditions. He allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands, marking a new era of imperial policy built on tolerance and integration. With Babylon's fall to Persia, the last native Mesopotamian dynasty came to an end. Yet the Neo-Babylonian revival represented far more than a brief resurgence. It was a conscious culmination of nearly 3 millennia of cultural evolution along the Tigris and Euphrates. The city's temples, archives, and astronomical observations preserved the essence of Mesopotamian knowledge, ensuring that its influence would endure within the Persian Empire and beyond. In later centuries, Babylon became a symbol, admired for its grandeur, condemned for its pride, and remembered as the ultimate emblem of human achievement and impermanence. Even as political power shifted to Persia, Greece, and Rome, the intellectual and religious legacy of Babylon continued to echo through history. Its mathematical systems influenced Greek science. Its legal traditions informed later empires. Its cosmological concepts shaped the theological imagination of the ancient world. Thus, the Neo-Babylonian Age stands as the final flowering of the civilization born between the rivers, a synthesis of art, law, faith, and science that defined the world's first urban culture. From the ziggurats of Babylon to the distant observatories of later astronomers, the spirit of Mesopotamia endured, carried forward by the empires that succeeded it. In the coming era, a new kind of power would dominate the ancient world, the Persian Empire, whose rulers absorbed Mesopotamia into their vast dominion, but also inherited its administrative genius and spiritual heritage. Through Persia, the legacy of the two rivers would extend across continents, shaping the foundations of civilization itself. When Babylon's gates opened to Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, it marked more than the end of an empire. It was the passing of a torch. The cultural and administrative traditions forged in Mesopotamia over 3,000 years now flowed seamlessly into the emerging Achaemenid Persian Empire, a dominion that would stretch from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. The Persians did not erase Mesopotamia's legacy. They absorbed, refined, and projected it onto a grander stage. In doing so, they ensured that the lessons of the two rivers, the mastery of bureaucracy, the sanctity of law, and the concept of kingship as divine stewardship, would shape the course of civilization long after the ziggurats had crumbled. Cyrus, founder of the Persian Empire, demonstrated remarkable political insight in his treatment of Babylon. Rather than plundering the city or suppressing its traditions, he presented himself as the rightful heir to its ancient kings. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay inscription discovered in Babylon, records his declaration that he entered the city without battle and restored its temples and cults. He portrayed himself as chosen by Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity, to bring justice and peace to the land. This act of conscious continuity, adopting Mesopotamian symbols and language, revealed an understanding of the deep cultural weight Babylon carried in the ancient world. Under Persian rule, Babylon became one of the empire's principal administrative and cultural centers. It served as a regional capital, hosting satraps, provincial governors, who oversaw taxation, justice, and infrastructure. The Persians retained much of the Babylonian bureaucratic system, including its scribes, measurement standards, and archival practices. The use of Akkadian cuneiform continued in official documents, even as Aramaic emerged as the lingua franca of the empire. This fusion of linguistic and administrative traditions allowed the Achaemenid government to manage a realm of immense diversity with unprecedented efficiency. Persian governance itself bore the unmistakable imprint of Mesopotamian precedent. The Achaemenid kings conceived of themselves not as conquerors, but as custodians of order, guardians of Asha, the Zoroastrian principle of truth and harmony. This ideology resonated strongly with the Mesopotamian idea of kingship as divine duty. The concept that the ruler was chosen by the gods to uphold justice, ensure prosperity, and maintain balance between heaven and earth had originated in the temples of Sumer and matured through the codes of Hammurabi and the edicts of Assyria. Now, under Persia, it became a transnational creed. Economically, the integration of Mesopotamia into the Persian realm revitalized long-distance trade. The empire's famous royal road, stretching from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa and Persepolis in Iran, connected with the older routes along the Tigris and Euphrates. Babylon and other Mesopotamian cities became vital nodes in this network, linking the Mediterranean with Central Asia and India. Caravans and river barges carried textiles, metals, spices, and precious stones, while standardized coinage introduced by Darius I facilitated commerce across vast distances. Darius I, who reigned from 522 to 486 BCE, institutionalized the administrative structures that allowed the Persian Empire to endure for 2 centuries. His reforms, territorial divisions, tax systems, codified laws, and official record-keeping, reflected centuries of Mesopotamian influence. The Persians elevated efficiency to an imperial philosophy. Satraps were required to submit annual reports, scribes maintained detailed archives, and inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears ensured loyalty. This bureaucratic precision, born of the scribal cultures of Ur, Akkad, and Babylon, became the backbone of Persian governance. Religiously and intellectually, the Achaemenids continued to draw on Mesopotamian traditions. Temples across the region remained active, and priests continued to interpret celestial omens, a science that had reached exceptional sophistication under Babylonian scholars. The Persian rulers patronized these traditions, recognizing their political and spiritual utility. Astronomers at Babylon's temples, particularly the Sagila, continued to compile detailed astronomical diaries, documenting planetary motions and eclipses. Their records would later influence Greek astronomy through scholars like Hipparchus and Ptolemy, establishing a direct line from Mesopotamian observation to classical science. The Persians also inherited Mesopotamia's architectural sensibilities. The monumental palaces of Persepolis, with their columned halls and reliefs depicting tribute bearers from across the empire, reflect the influence of earlier Mesopotamian artistic conventions. The precision of brickwork, the symbolic use of relief sculpture to project authority, and the integration of religion and politics into public architecture all echoed the heritage of the 2 rivers. The Achaemenid kings, though ethnically and religiously distinct, positioned themselves as heirs to a continuous imperial ideal stretching back to Sumer. Cultural continuity was further reinforced through education and language. Babylon remained a center of scribal training, where students continued to learn cuneiform alongside Aramaic and Persian scripts. Texts on mathematics, law, and medicine were copied and studied well into the 4th century BCE. Even after the decline of temple institutions, the intellectual prestige of Babylonian learning persisted. Greek travelers such as Herodotus and later Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing under Hellenistic rule, recorded elements of Mesopotamian cosmology and history, ensuring that its influence entered the Mediterranean world. Under Persian administration, the old Mesopotamian cities maintained their identity as sacred and scholarly centers. Ur and Uruk remained sites of worship, where Sippah continued to honor Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing. Yet Babylon itself stood apart, as both a functioning metropolis and a symbol. The Persians held coronation ceremonies there, acknowledging that legitimacy in the Near East still required recognition by Marduk. Even after Darius built Persepolis as a new imperial capital, Babylon retained its aura as the ancient seat of civilization. However, time inevitably eroded this continuity. By the 4th century BCE, internal revolts and external pressures weakened Persian control. The rise of Alexander the Great in the West introduced a new epoch of conquest and cultural transformation. In 331 BCE, Alexander defeated Darius III at Gaugamela and marched into Babylon, which welcomed him as a liberator much as it had once welcomed Cyrus. Struck by its grandeur, Alexander ordered the restoration of its temples and planned to make Babylon the administrative center of his empire. His death in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the height of his ambition, lent the city a final symbolic weight. It was both the cradle of civilization and the tomb of the world's most celebrated conqueror. After Alexander, Mesopotamia passed under the rule of the Seleucids, successors of his empire, who built new Greek-style cities such as Seleucia on the Tigris. Yet, even amid Hellenization, the older traditions persisted. Cuneiform continued to be used for astronomical and ritual texts until the 1st century CE, making Mesopotamia the longest-lived literate culture in human history. Through the Persians and later the Greeks, the intellectual and political achievements of Mesopotamia spread westward. Concepts of law, empire, and centralized administration, born in Sumer and perfected in Babylon, became the foundations upon which later civilizations would build. The Persian model of imperial governance, structured, tolerant, and efficient, owed its essence to the world of the two rivers. By the time the Parthians and Sasanians ruled over Mesopotamia in later centuries, the ancient cities had faded, but their spirit endured in the administrative language of empire, the organization of states, and the celestial mathematics of scholars. The rivers still flowed, but the civilizations that had once dominated their banks had become history, absorbed into the collective memory of humankind. Yet, through Persia, their legacy achieved immortality. The Achaemenids transformed Mesopotamian wisdom into a universal model of empire. Their inscriptions, from Cyrus to Darius, echoed the same ideals found in Sumerian hymns, that kings rule by divine favor, that order must triumph over chaos, and that justice is the measure of a ruler's worth. This continuity of ideas, stretching from the ziggurats of Ur to the palaces of Persepolis, formed the intellectual bridge between the ancient and classical worlds. As Persian power reached its zenith, the heart of Mesopotamia remained vital, a region of scholars, priests, and merchants who preserved the oldest traditions of recorded thought. Though the centers of power would shift westward to Greece and Rome, the intellectual foundations laid in the lands between the rivers continued to shape the architecture of empires and the philosophy of governance for millennia. In the centuries that followed, the world would change beyond recognition. Yet in every system of law, in every ordered state, and in every ruler who sought legitimacy through justice and divine right, the pulse of ancient Mesopotamia would still beat, quiet but eternal. As the centuries passed after the fall of the Persian Empire, the cities of the Tigris and Euphrates entered a quieter but no less significant era. The region, once the vibrant heart of empire and innovation, became a repository of memory, a living archive of humanity's earliest experiments in civilization. While political power shifted to new centers in Greece, Rome, and later Byzantium, the echoes of Mesopotamia continued to shape thought, religion, and governance across continents. The great cities, Babylon, Uruk, and Nippur, declined in size and influence, but their names endured, carried in sacred texts, scholarly traditions, and oral histories that linked later ages to the dawn of recorded time. In the Hellenistic period following Alexander's death, Seleucid rulers established Greek-style administrations in Mesopotamia, merging local traditions with new cultural frameworks. Seleucia on the Tigris, built near Babylon, became the region's primary metropolis, symbolizing both continuity and transformation. Greek settlers introduced their language, architecture, and civic institutions, but they also relied heavily on the administrative systems perfected under the Babylonians and Persians. The scribes of Babylon continued to record celestial movements, produce economic tablets, and copy ancient texts, maintaining an unbroken intellectual chain stretching back more than 2 millennia. Even as temples diminished in power, their libraries endured, safeguarding the intellectual heritage of the world's first urban society. One of the most remarkable features of this period was the persistence of cuneiform writing. Though Greek had become the language of administration and culture, Babylonian scholars continued to use the wedge-shaped script for specialized fields such as astronomy, mathematics, and ritual practice. The last known cuneiform text, a record of astronomical observations, was written around the 1st century CE, nearly 3,000 years after the first pictographs appeared in Uruk. This continuity represents one of the longest sustained intellectual traditions in human history, linking the prehistoric world with the dawn of the modern age. Under the Parthian and Sasanian empires, which ruled Mesopotamia from the 3rd century BCE to the 7th century CE, the land between the rivers remained a crossroads of trade and culture. The great caravan routes that connected the Mediterranean to India and China passed through the region, bringing with them goods, ideas, and religions. Zoroastrianism flourished under the Sasanians, but older Mesopotamian deities still lingered in local traditions. Ancient temples were repurposed, and rural communities preserved echoes of Sumerian and Akkadian myth in their seasonal rituals. The idea that the cosmos was ordered by divine law, first articulated in Sumer, persisted in the theological systems of Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and later Islam. The most profound transmission of Mesopotamian legacy occurred not through conquest, but through scripture and story. Babylon had long been enshrined in the Hebrew Bible, where its grandeur and moral symbolism left an indelible mark on Western thought. The Tower of Babel became a parable about human ambition and divine order, reflecting the city's association with linguistic diversity and monumental aspiration. The Epic of Gilgamesh, rediscovered millennia later, would emerge as one of the oldest surviving works of world literature, capturing the human struggle against mortality in a form that transcended culture and time. During the early centuries of the Common Era, the intellectual remnants of Mesopotamia were absorbed into Greek and Roman scholarship. Babylonian astronomical knowledge influenced Hipparchus, Ptolemy, and later Islamic astronomers, forming the basis of celestial calculation in the ancient and medieval worlds. The Mesopotamian sexagesimal, base 60, system of mathematics survived in the way humans measure time and angles, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, silent yet enduring evidence of an ancient mind's logic embedded in modern life. The conquest of Mesopotamia by Islamic armies in the 7th century CE introduced a new phase of cultural synthesis. The Abbasid Caliphate, which established Baghdad near the ruins of ancient Ctesiphon, consciously chose the region as its capital for symbolic and practical reasons. Baghdad, city of peace, rose on the same fertile plain where the first cities had been born, and its architects and scholars inherited both the physical and intellectual foundations of the civilizations that had come before. The caliphs patronized translation projects that brought Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge into Arabic, but the methods of record-keeping, land management, and statecraft they employed were deeply rooted in Mesopotamian precedent. In the House of Wisdom, Baghdad's legendary center of learning, scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, and medicine using data that could be traced to Babylonian sources. They refined algorithms for planetary motion based on cuneiform-era observations and continued to apply the base 60 system. In this way, the spirit of Mesopotamian science survived through the medium of Arabic scholarship, later to pass into Europe through Latin translations during the Renaissance. The Tigris and Euphrates continued to define life in the region, their floods both blessing and threat. Islamic engineers and administrators maintained the irrigation systems first dug by Sumerian farmers 5,000 years earlier. Even the land's agricultural rhythms, the planting of barley, the management of canals, the measurement of land by cubits, followed patterns established in antiquity. The continuity of daily life in Mesopotamia across epochs stands as one of history's most astonishing examples of cultural persistence. Meanwhile, the memory of the ancient empires faded into legend. The ziggurats eroded into shapeless mounds, their bricks scavenged by local builders. The names of kings and gods became distorted in oral lore. To later generations, the world of Sumer and Akkad belonged to the realm of myth rather than history. Babylon became synonymous not with innovation but with excess, a warning in the scriptures, a symbol in the arts. The real story of the civilization between the rivers lay buried beneath the soil, waiting for rediscovery. That rediscovery would come many centuries later, beginning in the 19th century with European exploration and archaeology. Travelers like Claudia Rich, Henry Rawlinson, and Austin Henry Layard ventured into the deserts of Iraq and Syria, uncovering the remnants of Assyria and Babylon. Rawlinson's decipherment of cuneiform writing in the 1850s unlocked a forgotten world, revealing the voices of kings, merchants, and priests who had spoken across millennia. The clay tablets of Nineveh and Ur restored to humanity a record older than the Bible and older than Greece, a written testimony of the first civilizations. The recovery of Mesopotamian history fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of itself. For the first time, scholars could trace the origins of writing, law, urban planning, and organized religion to specific times and places. The myths of creation, flood, and divine kingship once thought unique to later cultures were shown to have much older antecedents in Sumerian and Akkadian literature. The figure of Gilgamesh emerged as a proto-hero, the first to question mortality and seek wisdom beyond the limits of human life. The story of Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, offered insights into how early societies understood the relationship between chaos, order, and divine authority. These discoveries restored the human dimension to Mesopotamian civilization. The people of the two rivers were no longer shadowy figures in biblical metaphor, but real communities with ambitions, fears, and achievements as complex as those of any later age. Archaeologists uncovered entire cities, Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Mari, revealing streets, palaces, and temples still bearing the marks of their builders' hands. Inscriptions recorded trade agreements, land disputes, and hymns of devotion, showing that the concerns of daily life, justice, faith, prosperity, remained constant across time. By the early 20th century, Mesopotamia had become the foundation of a new academic discipline, Assyriology, the study of ancient Near Eastern languages and cultures. Universities across Europe and America established departments devoted to decoding and contextualizing cuneiform texts. Thousands of tablets found their way into museums, where scholars pieced together the administrative machinery of ancient states, the details of ancient economies, and the philosophical reflections of early thinkers. The echoes of the two rivers had become voices once again, audible and articulate. Modern nations built upon these ancient lands, first the Ottoman provinces, then the modern state of Iraq, found in Mesopotamian history both a source of pride and a challenge. The ruins of Ur and Babylon became symbols of identity, while the study of cuneiform offered a tangible link between the contemporary world and the first stirrings of human civilization. Yet, even as the past was honored, it was also fragile. Wars, looting, and neglect threatened to erase what millennia had preserved. Each destroyed site became a reminder of how easily humanity can lose touch with its origins. Today, the legacy of Mesopotamia endures in ways both visible and subtle. Every written document, every contract, every law owes something to the scribes of Sumer. Every clock that divides the hour into 60 minutes echoes the calculations of Babylonian astronomers. The very concept of a city, planned, ordered, and governed, was born along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The world we inhabit is, in countless small ways, a descendant of their creation. In the end, the civilization of the two rivers did not vanish, it transformed. Its languages fell silent, but its principles survived, in religion, governance, mathematics, and thought. Through conquest and translation, ruin and rediscovery, the Mesopotamian mind continued to shape the world's understanding of what it means to build, to rule, and to remember. For centuries, the story of Mesopotamia lay hidden beneath sand and stone. The world that had given rise to writing, law, and empire was remembered only in fragments, biblical allusions, half-remembered myths, and travelers' tales of ruined towers and buried cities. Yet beneath the mounds of Iraq and Syria, the clay archives of the world's first civilization waited silently for rediscovery. The process by which modern humanity reclaimed this forgotten heritage was itself a triumph of curiosity and intellect, a renewal of the same impulse that had driven the Sumerian scribes to record their world 5,000 years before. The modern rediscovery of Mesopotamia began in the early 19th century, an age of exploration and empire. Western travelers, merchants, missionaries, and diplomats encountered vast earthen mounds rising from the plains near the Tigris and Euphrates. Local inhabitants called them tells, knowing little of the civilizations buried beneath. Early explorers such as Claudius James Rich and Ptolemy Botta began to suspect that these mounds concealed the ruins of ancient cities mentioned in classical and biblical sources. In 1843, Botta's excavations at Khorsabad revealed the magnificent palace of Sargon II, an Assyrian king whose name had long been known only from inscriptions on scattered artifacts. The discoveries that followed reshaped human history. Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh in the 1840s and 1850s uncovered colossal stone reliefs, winged bulls, and the libraries of Assyrian kings. Among the most extraordinary finds were the thousands of clay tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, preserved in the ruins of Nineveh. These tablets contained administrative records, letters, medical texts, and, most astonishingly, literary works written in cuneiform. When the script was deciphered, scholars realized they were reading the thoughts of a civilization 3,000 years older than Greece or Rome. The decipherment of cuneiform ranks among the greatest intellectual achievements of the 19th century. The key breakthrough came from Henry Rawlinson, a British officer and linguist who studied the multilingual inscription on the Behistun rock in modern Iran. Carved into a cliff face by the Persian king Darius I, the text contained parallel versions in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By comparing the known Persian text with the others, Rawlinson succeeded in unlocking the phonetic values of the cuneiform signs. His work, published in the 1850s, opened the archives of Mesopotamia to the modern world. As scholars learned to read the tablets, the true scope of Mesopotamian civilization became clear. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from the library of Ashurbanipal, offering humanity its earliest surviving literary masterpiece. The Code of Hammurabi, discovered at Susa, revealed a sophisticated legal system based on justice, equity, and accountability. Administrative tablets from Ur, Lagash, and Kish showed complex systems of labor management, taxation, and trade regulation, proof that bureaucracy itself had been invented in the Fertile Crescent. Suddenly, the biblical land of Shinar and the plains of Shinar were no longer mythic symbols but tangible realities populated by real people, recorded in their own words. By the early 20th century, systematic archaeology replaced the treasure hunting of the previous era. Scholars such as Leonard Woolley, Ernest de Sarzeck, and Henry Frankfurt brought scientific precision to excavation. Woolley's work at Ur between 1922 and 1934 revealed royal tombs filled with exquisite artifacts, lyres, jewelry, and ritual vessels, illustrating the wealth and artistry of early Sumerian society. The discovery of Queen Pwabi's burial chamber, complete with attendants and offerings, provided vivid insight into the ritual and social hierarchies of early Mesopotamia. Each discovery expanded the picture of Mesopotamian life. Archaeologists reconstructed irrigation systems, urban layouts, and temple complexes, showing how the environment had shaped the region's development. The two rivers, both nurturing and destructive, had demanded collective organization and technical ingenuity. This need had driven the rise of centralized authority, record-keeping, and written law. The interplay between geography and governance, between floodplain and faith, emerged as one of the great themes of human history. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia also forced a re-evaluation of the origins of civilization itself. For centuries, Western scholars had looked to Greece as the cradle of culture and reason. The unearthing of Uruk and Babylon demonstrated that the foundations of literacy, mathematics, and statecraft were far older and more diverse. The Sumerians had created the world's first script, developed the concept of urban planning, and established systems of law and taxation. Their intellectual descendants, the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, refined these innovations into the structures that would underpin all later civilizations. As museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and New York filled with Mesopotamian artifacts, public fascination with the ancient Near East grew. The colossal Lamassu statues, the black diorite stele of Hammurabi, and the delicate cylinder seals of Sumer captured the imagination of audiences worldwide. Yet this global interest came with ethical and political consequences. Many treasures were removed from their original sites during periods of colonial control, sparking ongoing debates about cultural ownership and preservation. In the second half of the 20th century, new technologies deepened the study of Mesopotamia. Aerial photography, radiocarbon dating, and satellite imaging allowed archaeologists to map ancient canal systems and identify lost cities beneath modern landscapes. Excavations at sites like Tel Brak, Nippur, and Mari revealed the gradual transition from village societies to urban states. The discovery of early administrative tablets at Uruk pushed the invention of writing to around 3200 BC, centuries earlier than once believed. The growing body of evidence transformed our understanding of human development. The idea of civilization was no longer tied to a single culture or continent, but recognized as a process of adaptation, innovation, and social coordination. Mesopotamia stood at the beginning of this process, not as an isolated phenomenon, but as a prototype for how humans everywhere would learn to manage resources, institutions, and ideas. Modern Mesopotamian studies have continued to evolve, integrating archaeology with genetics, climatology, and linguistics. DNA analysis of ancient remains has traced population movements between Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Indus Valley. Paleoclimatic data has revealed how shifts in rainfall and river flow influence the rise and fall of cities. These insights reinforce a central truth, that civilization is not a linear progression, but a delicate balance between human ambition and environmental constraint, a lesson first learned beside the Tigris and Euphrates. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia also reconnected modern peoples with the earliest expressions of human thought. The Sumerian hymns and proverbs, the Akkadian laments and royal inscriptions reveal minds preoccupied with justice, mortality, and the search for meaning. They remind us that the questions that define humanity today, about order, suffering, and the divine, were first asked in the temples of Ur and the palaces of Babylon. In their struggle to understand their world, the ancients laid the foundations for philosophy, religion, and science alike. Today, Mesopotamia's archaeological sites face challenges of preservation amid conflict, development, and environmental change. The destruction of artifacts in recent decades has underscored both the fragility of cultural heritage and its enduring significance. Each lost tablet, each toppled statue, represents not only a fragment of ancient history, but a piece of humanity's collective memory. Efforts by international organizations and local scholars to restore and protect these sites affirm a shared responsibility to remember, to study, and to safeguard the record of our beginnings. The story of rediscovery is thus more than an academic pursuit. It is an act of restoration, of giving voice to the silent and form to the forgotten. The archaeologist's trowel, the philologist's translation, and the historian's interpretation all contribute to the same endeavor that once animated the Sumerian scribe, to make meaning durable, to preserve knowledge against the erosion of time. Through this process, Mesopotamia has reclaimed its rightful place as the first chapter of the human narrative. Its rediscovery has not only illuminated the ancient past, but also reshaped our understanding of civilization as a shared human achievement. From the earliest tablets of Uruk to the digital archives of the present day, the impulse to record, to measure, and to reflect remains unbroken, a continuous thread connecting the dawn of history to the world we inhabit now. The civilization that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers did not vanish when its temples fell or when its kings' names were forgotten. Its essence, its ideas, systems, and discoveries became part of the fabric of human progress. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not confined to the ruins of Ur or the tablets of Nineveh. It lives within the very foundations of modern thought, governance, science, and daily life. Across millennia, Its achievements have quietly shaped how societies organize, how they reason, and how they define the relationship between humankind and the divine. The most profound and enduring contribution of Mesopotamia was writing. When Sumerian scribes impressed wedge-shaped symbols onto clay around 3200 BCE, they did more than record transactions. They changed the human relationship to memory and time. Writing made it possible to preserve knowledge beyond the limits of individual recollection. It allowed governments to issue decrees, priests to record rituals, and merchants to track trade across regions. From these humble tablets evolved the principles of literacy, education, and historical continuity. Every document written since, every law, poem, and scientific record, descends conceptually from the invention of cuneiform. Alongside writing came the birth of law and governance. The Code of Ur-Nemu and the later Code of Hammurabi codified justice in tangible form, replacing arbitrary authority with standardized rules. These early codes introduced ideas that remain central to modern legal systems, that law should be public, that punishment should fit the crime, and that rulers are accountable to a higher moral order. The phrase carved on Hammurabi's stele, "to cause justice to prevail in the land," resonates across the centuries, reflected in constitutions, declarations, and charters of rights around the world. Mesopotamia also pioneered the organization of the state. Its city-states were the earliest experiments in urban governance, complex entities with bureaucracy, taxation, and public works. The management of canals and agricultural surplus required record-keeping, labor allocation, and planning. From these administrative necessities grew the first bureaucratic class: scribes, overseers, and accountants. The concept of a government as a structured institution, rather than the property of a single ruler, was born beside the rivers of Sumer. The very idea of the public servant traces its lineage to the officials who measured grain, recorded taxes, and maintained irrigation networks in Ur and Lagash. In religion and philosophy, Mesopotamian influence is equally profound. Its cosmology introduced the idea of an ordered universe governed by divine will, a moral and cosmic structure that influenced Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The narrative patterns of Mesopotamian mythology, creation from chaos, divine judgment, the flood, and the search for immortality, reappear throughout later sacred texts. The story of Gilgamesh's journey to find eternal life anticipates later philosophical and theological explorations of mortality. Even the notion of a paradise lost and regained echoes through millennia, rooted in the Sumerian myth of Dilmun and the fall of humanity through disobedience. Mesopotamia's scientific and mathematical achievements laid the groundwork for future discoveries. The Babylonians developed the sexagesimal, or base 60, numerical system, still used to measure time and angles. Their astronomical records, spanning centuries, enabled the prediction of eclipses and the calculation of planetary cycles. These observations formed the basis of Greek and Islamic astronomy and, ultimately, modern celestial mechanics. Mesopotamian mathematics included concepts of geometry, algebra, and compound interest, proving that abstract reasoning and applied science were flourishing thousands of years before classical antiquity. The art and architecture of Mesopotamia also left a lasting aesthetic and symbolic legacy. The stepped ziggurat, rising from the plains in tiers of brick, prefigured monumental architecture across civilizations. Its design symbolized the link between heaven and earth, a concept echoed in later temples, pyramids, and cathedrals. The artistic conventions of relief carving, narrative friezes, and iconographic symbolism developed in Assyria and Babylon influenced the artistic traditions of Persia, Greece, and Rome. Even in modern times, echoes of Mesopotamian design can be seen in the revivalist architecture of museums, monuments, and civic buildings that draw inspiration from ancient forms of power and symmetry. Economically, Mesopotamia pioneered systems that remain recognizable today. It introduced money substitutes, standardized weights and measures, and institutionalized trade. Clay tokens evolved into early accounting methods, leading to the abstraction of value that underpins modern economics. Merchants and temple administrators developed contracts, loans, and partnerships, the conceptual ancestors of banking. The idea that commerce could be governed by regulation and record rather than personal trust was one of Mesopotamia's great social innovations, allowing complex economies to flourish. Culturally, the intellectual legacy of Mesopotamia persisted long after its cities were abandoned. Through the Persians, Greeks, and Islamic scholars, its knowledge became embedded in global learning. The medieval Islamic astronomers of Baghdad refined the tables of Babylonian sky watchers. European scholars, centuries later, rediscovered those calculations in Arabic texts. The philosophical continuity from Mesopotamian reflection on destiny and justice to modern human thought illustrates how ideas transcend time, adapting to new contexts without losing their essence. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia in modern times did more than illuminate the past. It transformed the study of human civilization. Archaeology, as a discipline, emerged from efforts to understand the ruins of the Near East. Assyriology and comparative linguistics evolved to decode the languages and records of the ancient world. Museums became repositories of shared heritage, and universities built new branches of historical inquiry devoted to the ancient Near East. In this way, the ruins of Mesopotamia helped shape modern academia itself. The symbolic power of Mesopotamia continues to resonate in contemporary culture. The term Babylon has transcended geography to become a metaphor for ambition, corruption, and human creativity. The myths of Sumer and Akkad inspire literature, film, and art. The story of Gilgamesh has been translated into hundreds of languages, influencing modern narratives of friendship, heroism, and existential reflection. The idea that civilization is both a triumph and a burden, that progress comes with cost, originates in the self-awareness of the Mesopotamian scribes who first chronicled their rulers' deeds. The environmental lessons of Mesopotamia remain urgent. The collapse of early cities like Ur and Akkad was linked to salinization of farmland, overuse of water, and shifting river courses. These ancient challenges mirror modern concerns about sustainability and resource management. In studying the rise and fall of these civilizations, historians and scientists see not only the roots of human achievement, but also the recurring patterns of adaptation and decline that continue to shape societies today. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Mesopotamia's legacy is its humanity. The tablets that survive do not only record laws and taxes, they preserve songs, prayers, and private letters. One Sumerian father wrote to his son at a distant temple school, urging diligence in study. A Babylonian astronomer recorded his doubts about a planetary omen. A woman of Ur listed the household goods she lent to her neighbor. These voices, ordinary yet immortal, remind us that the people of Mesopotamia were not abstractions but individuals with dreams, responsibilities, and emotions much like our own. Through them, we see that civilization is not defined solely by monuments or empires, but by the enduring capacity of humans to communicate, organize, and imagine. The spirit that once guided the builders of Uruk and the scribes of Nineveh still guides the scientists, lawmakers, and artists of today. The continuity of curiosity, order, and expression links the ancient and modern worlds in a single human narrative. In the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, humanity's first great experiment in civilization took root. It flourished, faltered, and transformed, but it never truly ended. From the invention of writing to the codification of law, from the study of the stars to the governance of cities, the legacy of the two rivers remains woven into the fabric of our global civilization. The stones of Ur may have crumbled, the palaces of Babylon may have turned to dust, but their spirit endures, in every document, in every city, and in every thought that seeks to understand the order of the world. In the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, humanity's first great experiment in civilization came to an end, leaving lessons that still inform the modern world.